Okay, welcome back. Here in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the HTML5 inputs that were implemented when HTML5 became a thing. So a cool thing about HTML5 is not only are there new tags, but there are a bunch of new inputs, which not only allow for better usability in some cases, but the inputs are technically more semantic. The inputs are a little less than just generic text inputs or text area inputs. They can be a number of different things, like a search input, an email input, URL, number, date, so on and so forth. Now, a note before we get started here and talk about these inputs is, because this is a pretty progressive feature, some of these things don't actually work in all browsers. That's kind of the thing about HTML5. Not everything works across the board or across the web, so to speak. And HTML5 inputs are very much, they can be an issue in some ways because for pretty progressive browsers like Google Chrome or Apple Safari, it will, for the most part, make these inputs will work in the way that they were kind of intended. But they won't always work, and sometimes you can run into some issues. Now, we're going to go ahead and learn a little bit about these inputs and how to implement them, and then I'll talk a little bit about usability and the potential issues they can cause once we get through. So I've already taken the liberty of doing this HTML for you. So I've added it as a download to this lecture, but it's also a part of the course files that you downloaded at the very beginning of the HTML section a ways back. And it's just an HTML file called html5_inputs.html. Now, if you want, I actually encourage you to open up a new file and just follow along as I talk about these and type them out just to kind of see how they work and get used to typing out these new inputs. But with that being said, I'm just going to talk about them in this lecture rather than code them, because it can be just a little repetitive and mundane when I could just show you what they look like in their context and you could just kind of follow along. Okay, so before we get started, I want to talk to you about associating your labels to your inputs. This is good user experience. What we've done in the past is just add a label and an input afterwards. But technically, the browser had no way of knowing if that label and that input had any relation. You know, this label could have been related to this input for as far as the browser is concerned, because there's nothing saying this label is related to this input. But this is where this comes in. The label has an attribute called for, and it's looking for, in the value of that attribute, the ID of the input that it is for. So down here we have the input type text and the ID of fname. And that is the same as the for value for the label, which means they are associated. But a benefit of this is it actually lets you click the label to focus on the input. So watch this. Do you see that? So that not only it gives you the option to click in the input, but it gives you the ability to just click the label. So you have a bigger target area to focus on the input, and that's good user experience. That's good practice to implement. So that's what we're going to do from this point forward. Moving down, the new HTML5 inputs, we have, first and foremost, the search input. Basically, the way that you're going to make these inputs different from each other is by changing the type. And so that's what makes the rest of these inputs different from just the generic text input. So the type here is search. And over here in the browser, you can see it creates a sort of, a different input, but you can see it's even the native browser settings style here in Chrome is to have a rounded corner, and that doesn't really mean anything other than that's just how they've decided to style it. You can change that. But if you click in here and start typing, you kind of get a little X icon here to cancel your search. So it's not really going to make search better, but it's just a more semantic way of typing in search. And in some browsers, that feature won't appear at all. In fact, as we go through, some of the benefits of using these inputs don't show up in other browsers at all. So you shouldn't rely exclusively on the HTML5 input type to work. It's more so for semantic purposes and being a progressive coder. So that's the search input. Obviously, you'd use it for like a website search or something like that, a search input. Next up, we have the email input. And we've already played around with this one in a few lectures in the past. And the type is simply email, and you just type in an email. And that's just more so for semantic purposes. In some browsers, if you do add an attribute here, a standalone attribute where you just say required, you don't even have to have a kind of the value and attribute sort of name. You could just have it say required as a standalone sort of attribute. In some browsers, that will actually perform a validation and check to see if an email was input. But again, you shouldn't rely on that exclusively because there are a lot of browsers that don't understand yet. Poor little browsers. Next up, URL. So you use the type URL, and that basically is looking for a URL. Again, if you were to add the required attribute, the HTML5 required attribute, then in some browsers it will perform a validation, meaning it will check to see if it actually is a valid URL. So kind of cool. Now, what you would sort of do in that sort of case is you could say required, and browsers that do have validation built in with these HTML5 inputs, it will validate. But browsers that don't, you would have a fallback validation solution like a plugin like a PHP plugin or a jQuery plugin that will perform validation if this one fails to do its job. But we'll get there eventually. We don't need to talk about that yet. Number. This is kind of a neat one because sometimes the browser has a built-in ability to increment it as a number by clicking the little arrows here on the right side of the input. Again, some browsers don't have that, so you shouldn't rely on that. But what you can do is have the ability to put a min value attribute here and a max attribute, and you can put the values, whatever the min and maximum numbers you want to be, and step is another attribute, and that means how much do you want the number to increment by. So this is going to go in increments of 5 to a minimum of 5 and to a maximum of 50. So kind of cool. Range. This is kind of another number-based input. The type is range, and it lets you just use a kind of a user interface element here to drag kind of a range slider, draggable slider. Again, I wouldn't entirely rely on this input because some browsers might not understand it. But if you want to be progressive, you can try it out. But then the purpose of this is to more fine tune your numbers rather than type in your numbers like 12. You could do something like this to drag it to the number you want, and you would have an additional input with JavaScript or jQuery giving you feedback based on what number you're actually on. And the min and max basically means the minimum value is 1, the maximum value is 100, so therefore 1 to 100 could be 100%. And value is 0, so it starts at 0. Date. The type is date, and it lets you choose a date. And in good browsers like Chrome, it has kind of a placeholder. It lets you only type in a date. So here's the year. You type in like a date, and then the month. You could do something like this. Oh, not 45. There we go. Or you can kind of just use these little user inputs here, or the calendar picker here, which is kind of cool. It's built right in. But some browsers don't let you do it. For example, I'm just going to go to Safari here, and Safari doesn't have that option. I can type in letters, and there's no date picking calendar option. So you shouldn't rely on the built-in HTML5 functionality for that. But it's good for you to know because eventually browsers will catch up and they will work with this sort of thing. Month is another input. The type is month, and basically lets you just choose a month, like so. You could see in the Google Chrome calendar picker here, it chooses an entire month when I hover over the month here. So June 2015, I could change the year too by using the little incremental arrows here. But again, in some browsers like Safari and older browsers, this doesn't work. So you shouldn't rely simply on that. Week, same deal. You could just kind of choose a week from a calendar picker, and it actually chooses the week, of the year, 18, 19, 20, 21, so on and so forth. Time is another input. HTML5, the type is time, and it lets you choose an actual time. There you go. And you could change it like so. Again, basically for every one of these inputs, you can't really rely on the built-in functionality. You can still use them. It's not going to stop you from using it, because the fallback for other browsers, like Safari, for example, is just a generic looking input, but the attribute for the type is still whatever it is. So this is the time input, this is the week input, the month input. So it's good for semantic purposes. You coded it well by using the proper input attributes, but for browsers that don't support the built-in functionality of the input, it will just have a plain input text, so they can still write in a time like so. But on some browsers, like more progressive browsers like Google Chrome, you can actually choose a time like so. Date time is supposed to give you the ability to do a date and a time right in one input, but here in Google Chrome, it doesn't actually seem to support it. So it's kind of a pointless one right now. However, date time local works, which is essentially date time, but you can choose a local time zone, I believe. So it's kind of a little funny. Anyway, so that's date time local, and then color, type color. It's just a color picker, and it should pop up a color picker here, and you could choose a color. And if you had another input here, and you could use some JavaScript or jQuery to give you feedback based on what color you chose. So if you were doing some sort of form, like if you're customizing a profile or something like that, and you wanted to choose a color, then this is how you could do that. So yes, that is those are the HTML5 inputs. Like I said, it's progressive. They're very progressive, meaning a lot of them won't work in older browsers, even in some new browsers, like as you saw, Safari. So you shouldn't rely exclusively on its built-in functionality. If you're needing somebody to write a very specific format for a date, you shouldn't rely on the built-in functionality of the date input. You should have additional methods in place to ensure that the user types in the right format. So you could have helper text above the input saying, please ensure that you write it in this format. Or you can use a jQuery or PHP plugin to validate their input text to make sure that they did the right format. So there's lots of different things that you could do to improve user experience and the usability. But those are the inputs, and they are ready for you to use now in your websites, but you have to know that they don't work across all browsers. So you need to put different methods into place to make sure that you're doing the best you can to improve user experience.